Thank you very much indeed, Erica, and good evening, everybody. It's a very great pleasure to be here with you this evening. It's a particular pleasure to be among people who actually understand what freedom is. Yesterday, I spoke in Berkeley, and I was going to say, I've been very struck by the reaction when I say, yesterday I spoke in Berkeley. It's as if I've been a sort of a specials operation person parachuted in behind enemy lines. But yes, folks, I spoke in Berkeley and I lived. It really does seem to me that, conservatives will soon be needing their own sanctuary cities. For those of you who don't know me and my work, I'm a British journalist. I write for the Times of London. I do a lot of broadcasting for the BBC. I write twice a month for the Jerusalem Post. I live an extremely complicated life between continents, children, husband, work, and I can bore you with that if you like later on. But for this evening, I bring you greetings from that hotbed of revolution, Great Britain. We are really living through absolutely momentous times. Political developments are taking place. Choices are being made across the West, in Britain, in mainland Europe, and in America. Choices are being made which many never thought would be possible. People are taking collective decisions in these three continents, quite simply to bring about a different kind of society from the one that has been taken for granted for decades. In Britain really started this ball rolling, didn't it, with the great vote that happened last June of last year, for Brexit, for Britain's exit from the European Union. I'm glad to see you're so on side. I can assure you one can't be guaranteed of that reaction in Britain itself. As you undoubtedly know, there is a great difference between Britain and Europe. People talk about Britain as if it's in Europe, but as you will know, Britain is the lump of rock that many years ago somehow detached itself from the continent of Europe and floated off into the ocean, where it became marooned somewhere between the United States and mainland Europe, and where it has remained ever since. And as a result, Britain is in fact quite distinct from Europe. It is an island nation. It is the mothership, if I may put it that way, of American culture. It is the mothership of liberty in the world. It is America's intellectual, philosophical, political parent, and what happens in Britain is of great importance, I would suggest, to what happens in America, just as what happens in America is of great importance to what happens in Britain. So in Britain, the British people voted last year to leave the European Union, and this was a terrible shock to people who told themselves that this could never happen, and that the only people who wanted to leave the European Union, the only people in Britain who wanted it to leave the European, were knuckle-dragging troglodytes who had no intelligence and were obviously also completely insane. Well, there were millions of them, and that's how they voted. The shock has not subsided, I can tell you. In mainland Europe, the French presidential election, which concludes, in fact, this coming Sunday, when a new president of France will be chosen, the French presidential election is setting Marine Le Pen, whose National Front National party was once a fringe force under her father at the very edge of politics. This election has set her against another political outsider, Emmanuel Macron, in the fight to become president of France. Emmanuel Macron, her opponent, who belongs himself to no established party of either left or right, but seems to have come from outer space and is tipped to become the next president of France. He is said to have come from nowhere. Frankly, I don't believe that. Everyone comes from somewhere, and I'd like to know who is funding him, but that's another story. And of course, here in the United States, somebody became president who everybody said could never be elected to any responsible position in society whatsoever. Now, all this tumult has been going on against the background of Islamization in the West, the attempt to transform Western society, Western countries, through a combination of mass Islamic immigration and the escalating threat of Islamic terrorism. Now, all these events are linked. They all have different contexts, they all take different forms, but they are all linked. And it's common to say they are linked by a wave of populism across the West, which is sweeping away the established political order. Now, populism, I don't know whether it has the same meaning in this country as it does in Britain. You know what they say about being divided by a common language, but let's not enter into that private grief at the moment. Populism is a word which suggests disapproval. Populists are thought to be basically a mob of people behaving unreasonably. They may be popular, but because they are populist, they are people that are not really very nice to know. Well, very many people are now actively anxious about what is happening. They fear populism, which they equate with nationalism. And nationalism is bad because it leads to violence, it leads to war. They fear instability. They fear that dark forces are being unleashed. Now, I have a different view. Yes, I absolutely acknowledge there are great dangers from these convulsions. There are always risks and dangers from any change, and a major change or a set of major changes like this obviously brings risks and dangers because you don't really know what's going to happen. But I also think that these great convulsions going on in Britain, in America, and in Europe are also the first and only opportunity for the West to save itself from cultural suicide. Now, what's happening, as I've said, takes a different form and a different context in Britain, Europe, and America. But I would suggest to you that this great revolt that's taking place is not just against the political establishment, but against an entire world view, an entire view of the world and how it should be structured, which, in my view, has brought the West to its moral and political knees. The reason for my saying this is, let's look in a bit more closely what exactly this is a revolt against. As I say, it's not simply a revolt against a political establishment. It's not just a protest against an out-of-touch political elite that has kind of failed to take account of real people and what they actually are living through and what they want. That's part of it. It's not in this country simply a question of the Rust Belt being left behind by prosperity, although clearly that has played a part. It is, in my view, a protest against a world view, a view of how the world should be constructed, which has been steadily undermining the West for more than half a century. Let's look at this word nationalism, which is what this is said to be all about. In Britain, Brexit was nationalist. It was all about being in favour of little England as opposed to mighty multinational Europe. In Europe itself, these parties are said to be nationalist, ultra-nationalist, and nationalism is equated with fascism, with Nazism. There apparently is no distinction to be drawn between these constructs. In this country, it wasn't just nationalism that brought Donald Trump to power, apparently. It was white nationalism and white supremacism. All this, I don't have to tell you, is really, really bad. Calling it nationalism, however, in this pejorative way, I think shows that we just don't understand quite what has ailed the West for all these decades. Because I don't consider this protest to be an expression of nationalism in the pejorative sense that that word is used. I consider that at the root of this great revolt that's been going on is a desire for the restoration of Western national identity and of a patriotic feeling towards the Western nation on the basis that the Western nation is simply the best construct for life and liberty that has been invented in the history of the human race. Far from being a threat to decency and order, I would suggest the restoration of the Western nation is absolutely essential for the defense of the West and its values against whoever might be threatening it. Now, how do we get into a situation where the Western nation has come to be viewed by so many people who consider themselves to be progressive, who consider themselves to be on the side of all good things, morality, conscience, decency, progress, reason? How can it be that the Western nation has come to be equated in the progressive mind with everything that's bad? Well, I think that the detonator of this, I mean, one can go back a long way, but I would say that the most important detonator of this view was the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, in Europe, and I think beyond Europe, it was believed that the nation was at the root of what had happened in Europe, the rise of Nazism and fascism, the Holocaust, and the war. Because the nation led to nationalism, and nationalism creates a sense of exclusion, a sense of the other being excluded from your nation, and therefore it leads to prejudice and bigotry and ultimately war. So the thinking went that to prevent war and fascism from ever happening again, and indeed to excise prejudice from the human heart, then you had to emasculate the nation. Get rid of the nation, you get rid of nationalism. Get rid of nationalism, you get rid of prejudice, bigotry, and war. And instead of the nation, which was held to be inherently exclusive, discriminatory against those who didn't belong to that nation, you elevated instead, or what was elevated instead, was transnational institutions or supranational institutions and laws which had to take precedence. So, for example, a Western nation could not go to war in its own interests. It could only go to war if that act of war was sanctified by the sacred United Nations, because the United Nations was a transnational institution and therefore was, in its Olympian transnationalism, kind of objective. It didn't have a dog in the fight. And therefore, going to war would be kind of okay. Transnational institutions included laws such as universal human rights. In Britain, universal human rights, as embodied by the European Court of Human Rights and international law in general, that had to take precedence over domestic English law, because domestic English law reflected a nation which was exclusive of other nations, and instead, the only legitimate organization, if you like, was one that was transnational, because that embodied a kind of ideal of the brotherhood of man which brought people together rather than driving people apart. Now, what I'm describing is a worldview that just took over the progressive side of politics. But it was very, very much felt in mainland Europe itself. Mainland Europe said to itself, we must never again have a situation where Europe creates fascism and Nazism and another Holocaust and another world war. And that was really the fundamental idea behind the European Union. It wasn't called the European Union at the beginning, and over years it accrued more and more powers to itself. But nevertheless, the idea behind it, the European project, if you like, was based on the idea that the European nation, and in particular Germany, but not just Germany, the European nation in general, could never again be trusted never to descend again into barbarism. Europe regarded itself as the great expository of Western culture. It was high culture. Germany embodied high culture. The people who sent Jews to the slaughter were aficionados of Goethe, of opera. They played Mozart to each other. They were high culture, and therefore it was thought, how can it be that in a society which embodies reason and culture and the most civilized values, we have descended to this barbarism? The answer is it was the nation, and we must subjugate the nation so that it never again has any power. In other words, the subjugation of the nation was envisaged in the European Union idea to protect democracy and freedom. The West, through Europe, had to be protected against itself. Now, as I've said, Britain was never considered itself part of Europe. Britain was where liberty was invented, and it has a very particular concept of liberty, which is quite different from the European concept of liberty. In Britain, liberty consists of being able to do whatever you want, unless there is a law to prevent it. The European concept of liberty is nothing is allowed unless it is codified so that you have permission to do it. Now, Britain would never have joined the European project at all had it not been for the fact that at the end of the Second World War, having effectively won the war against fascism, Britain was itself deeply demoralized. It emerged from the end of the Second World War deeply in debt to America, and it emerged also having, in the famous words, lost an empire and never found a role. It had defined its position in the world, its sense of itself by its empire, and it was getting rid of the empire altogether. And so the British ruling class was very demoralized, and the British ruling class decided that Britain did not have a future, that it could sustain by itself. It could not be an economy by itself. One of the watchwords of the British ruling class, the established, the official class, was that its highest goal was the orderly management of decline. The most it could hope to do was to prevent riots on the streets as the country sank economically, politically. That was the state it was in, remarkable as it may seem. And so this demoralization made all its elites, its political elites, its cultural elites, its intellectual elites, very vulnerable to the destructive and dangerous ideas that were coming out around the end of the Second World War, all of which were based similarly on the premise that the West was innately bad. Because also, in large part, but not altogether but in large part because of the impact of the Holocaust and the war and fascism and Nazism, what we then had was the desire to change Western society by a cultural revolution. The Soviet Union was considered to be a failure long before the Berlin Wall fell and communism was declared dead on its feet. The progressive side of politics was ashamed of Soviet communism. It understood that it couldn't easily support such a vicious and useless regime. And so was born the idea that instead of relying on the workers to rise up and seize economic and political power, a completely different approach should be tried, which was to seize control of the institutions of Western culture, the universities, the schools, the media, the law, the churches, all the institutions of the culture. And in Britain, this was achieved to the letter. It was what's been called the long march through the institutions. They were subverted from within by a set of ideologies, a set of ideas, a set of beliefs, which were all very different, but all of which had at their root the idea that the foundational principles of the West were bad and had to be overturned because the West was bad. Why was the West bad? Well, the West was bad because it was capitalist, and therefore it was innately oppressive, and the West had, over the years, over the centuries, through empires, through the exercise of capitalism, through foreign wars, oppressed the developing peoples of the world. And so the idea grew that anything the West did was innately bad, and anything the developing world did was innately okay. And if the developing world did bad things, that could never be held responsible for its own actions because they were basically victims of the West. This was a constellation of absurd but very dangerous ideas which gripped the whole of the progressive side of politics in the West. It was very, very successful in Britain, unlike in America. In Britain, this is a different argument, a different topic completely, but in Britain, the churches, or the Church of England, did not play the role that your churches have played here. Here, your churches have, to a large extent, kind of tried to hold the line against what I'm talking about, because at the root of what I'm talking about is the attempt to destroy biblical morality. Your churches have attempted to hold the line. Whether they're successful or not is another matter. But in Britain, the Church of England led the flight away from these values. It's to do with the theology, it's to do with the sociology, it's another issue. But basically, there wasn't the bulwarks of resistance in Britain as there have been in America. And indeed, in continental Europe, Catholicism had more resistance to this than was so in Britain. But that's, as I say, another story. This cultural revolution, as I say, took the form of ideologies. Ideologies are isms, and there have been many isms that we are all subjected to. Moral and cultural relativism. The idea that there is no such thing as objective truth, there is no such thing as an objective moral authority, my opinion is of the same value as your opinion, my way of life is of the same value as your way of life, nobody can sit in judgment about anyone else's values, the only people that we should sit in judgment about are the people who sit in judgment. Multiculturalism, the idea that flowed from this, that no culture could be said to be superior to any other culture, from which it inevitably follows that the West cannot say that its values are better than anyone else's. If you say that actually we think it's better to have the Western society which has tolerance of people, which has equality for women, and so on, then you are basically a racist, because you are doing down another set of beliefs. Anti-racism itself became an unchallengeable shibboleth. We should all be anti-racist, I would suggest, in that it is a bad thing to look down on other cultures as inferior in the sense that that the people are inferior. But the idea of anti-racism took such a hold that it meant that anyone who was not white Western European was basically a victim of the West, and therefore they could do no wrong. And so anti-racism became a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card, a kind of guarantee of impunity of bad behavior by people who weren't white Western Europeans. And in my view, if you give people that sort of impunity, if you're saying you are not morally responsible for your actions, that means, in my book, you're not regarding them as properly a human being. And to me, that is racist. But that, again, is another story. Anyway, these ideas became completely unchallengeable. And they became unchallengeable for two reasons. First of all, they were ideologies. Now, the point about an ideology is it's not simply an argument, it's not simply a point of view. The point about an ideology is that it is inimical to argument. It repudiates the very idea of argument, and this is why. Most people, and I would hope that all of you would fall into this category, start from the premise that we look at the evidence, we look at reality, we look at what's going on, and then we arrive at a conclusion from that evidence. We can all disagree about the conclusions we arrive at, but that's the way round it is. We look at evidence, we arrive at a conclusion. With an ideology, you start with the conclusion. You start with the governing idea. And that governing idea, and this is where the second point kicks in, that governing idea cannot be challenged. Why? Because if you are a progressively minded person, then you stand for all good things. You stand for conscience. You stand for compassion. You stand for feeling. You stand for reason. You stand for progress. You stand for the betterment of society. This is axiomatic. So everything you believe, all the ideologies you believe, are virtuous. And consequently, if somebody comes along and says, well, excuse me, your ideas are very nice in theory, but here are 965 facts which actually show your ideas are rubbish, it doesn't matter what the evidence is for those ideas. You are a bad person because you have gone against someone who is the embodiment of virtue. And consequently, if you come along and say, but this is the truth, sorry, truth is a right-wing concept. So that broadly is what has happened, and that is why ideologies of the left are inimical to reason and to evidence, to thought itself, and that is very largely why we're in the state that we're in, where it's a kind of madness that people seem to be talking not just difference of views, but they're talking backwards. They're turning everything completely on its head. Now, in the United States, as I say, this cultural demoralization has also occurred among your intellectual elites, particularly in your universities. But at least here, as I've said before, you've had culture wars. But nevertheless, here, this way of thinking has made great inroads on your coasts. I know we're on a coast, but nevertheless, in universities. And there are different reasons here from Europe, from Britain. You don't flagellate yourselves over empire, at least I don't think you do, but you do flagellate yourselves over things like slavery and racism. But whatever the reasons are, and the reasons are all different, it's still self-flagellation. It's still the belief among your most educated classes that America was born in original sin. And that is the problem with the West. It thinks it was born in original sin. Now, this cultural, moral, political, intellectual, and spiritual demoralization, and I've only just sketched the surface of it, that has taken place in the West, has created a vacuum. It has hollowed out the society that we're living in to a greater or lesser extent. And into that vacuum has marched Islam, has marched Islamization, because the Islamists understand very, very well the West better than the West understands itself. The Islamists are religious people. They understand what a spiritual void looks like. They get it, and they see it. They saw it in Europe. They saw it in Britain. Britain, I think they thought, was the most advanced down this terrible road, and they thought it was true of America, and they got America slightly wrong, because they didn't understand the fight back within America. But anyway, they broadly got the point right, that the West was open for encroachment, both the threat from Islamist terrorism and cultural encroachment. And that is why, or it's not the only reason why, but that is one of the reasons why we've seen this mass migration of Muslims into Europe. According to Pew, if current trends continue, with the non-Muslim population in decline, because one of the side effects of cultural demoralization is that people stop having babies because they have no hope really for the future. The combination of the decline of the non-Muslim population with the Muslim population growing exponentially is that by 2030, according to one of Pew's forecasts, the total Muslim population in Europe will increase from approximately 18 million to nearly 30 million, and Muslims will make up more than 10% of the total population in 10 countries, including France and Belgium. These figures are probably out of date, but give you some idea of the kind of scale that we're talking about. And of course, that predates the gesture made by Angela Merkel in Germany, when, to everyone's utter astonishment, she looked at this great tide of migrants coming from the south to the north, making use of the core doctrine of the European Union that between countries there should be free movement of peoples. They were pouring into Greece and to Italy, and she said, let them in. Let them in. and 1 million Muslims, mainly young men, came into Germany, which has created enormous social problems in Germany, particularly of violence, and particularly of violence against women, so much so that Mrs. Merkel has said she is extremely concerned by these social problems. We can all wonder why Mrs. Merkel did this, but anyway, that's also another matter. Now, the problem has become, why this is such a problem, is not simply the sheer force of numbers which would overwhelm public services anywhere. It is that a very significant proportion of these Muslim migrants refuse to integrate into the European societies into which they are coming, and they demand instead that these European societies accommodate themselves to them. And the problem is that their values are inimical to core Western values of freedom, equality, and democracy. And a very large proportion of these Muslims, quite apart from their attitude to the West in general, hold very severely anti-Jewish attitudes. Now, I have to say, and it's something that's, I think, terribly important, and many people in this country tend to overlook this. It is true that there are many, many millions of Muslims who do not subscribe to this. They do not subscribe to this Islamist interpretation of their religion. By Islamist, I mean the interpretation which is the most hard line and which will not acknowledge any room at all for any kind of secular authority. The word of God is the word, is the law that should rule society. So it's inimical to a free society. But that is an interpretation of the religion, and I use the word Islamist for one reason alone, because I think it's very important that in the language we use, we should acknowledge there are millions of Muslims who really don't have any truck with this, who have come to Britain and to Europe because they want to escape from an Islamic society enforcing Islamic codes of law and morality. They want to enjoy Western human rights. They want the same things that you and I want, to have a good job, to earn enough money to raise their family in peace and security. And there are millions like that, and the majority of people who are the victims of Islamist violence are actually Muslims. So we have to keep that in mind. Nevertheless, there are millions of Muslims who either have violent intent or the intent to force Western society to adapt to the codes and laws of Islamic religious Islamic religious beliefs. Now, in the West, unfortunately, even given all that's happened, all the attacks that have happened, with people screaming Allahu Akbar as they do terrible things and murder large numbers of our fellow citizens, there is still a refusal by our political elites to even acknowledge what this is, that this is a form of religious fanaticism. You may have read in recent weeks there was a particularly dreadful attack in Westminster against the Houses of Parliament, in which a Muslim gentleman got a car or a truck and drove it along Westminster Bridge, which is just by the Houses of Parliament, mowing down pedestrians as he went. And he then jumped out of his vehicle. And you may find this impossible to believe, but he actually got inside the perimeter of the House of Commons. For various reasons, it doesn't have an armed policeman on the gate. I know you're American, I'm British, you don't understand that. And he was only shot dead by chance. There happened to be an armed policeman in the vicinity who was armed because he was the diplomatic protection squad for the defense minister. But he shot this terrorist dead, unfortunately, not before this terrorist had used a knife to stab one of the unarmed British police officers to death. Now, this caused tremendous trauma, as you may imagine, in Britain. A police officer had died, an unarmed police officer had been murdered, and these people had been mown down on the bridge. It was a terrible scene. Mrs. May, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, made an address to the House of Commons. Her address was considered to be masterly, very statesmanlike. She touched all the right bases, it was said. It couldn't be bettered, it was said. Well, I didn't share that view because it had one sentence in it. That sentence said words to the effect of, this attack was not anything to do with Islam. This attack was Islamist, it wasn't Islamic. Now, this takes linguistic illiteracy to a new level. I use the word Islamist for the reasons that I've said. It's very important to acknowledge there are Muslims who don't hold with any of this. But Islamism, political Islam, jihadi Islam, violent Islam, colonialist Islam, the Islam that threatens everybody else, that sort of Islam is a form of Islam. It is an interpretation of the religion. It's only one interpretation, but it is an interpretation of the religion. It's not Zoroastrian. It doesn't come from nowhere. To say it's Islamist but not Islamic is ridiculous. But that is the lengths to which our politicians go to deny that this thing has a religious basis. In this country, General H.R. McMaster, who we're told is an absolutely sterling individual, reportedly told the National Security Council staff that the label radical Islamic terrorism was not helpful because terrorists are un-Islamic. And in 2016, he described ISIS, reportedly, as cynically using a perverted interpretation of religion. Now, this is what I call Islamophobia Phobia. This is the terror of calling this thing that we're facing by its proper name. And there are many reasons for this phobia. But one of the many outcomes of this refusal to even to acknowledge what we're up against is not simply that you can't ever defeat or even deal properly with a threat if you can't even bring yourself to call it by its proper name, you can't deal with it. But one of the terrible things about this is that it abandons Muslim reformers. Because, yes, folks, there are Muslim reformers. They are amongst the bravest people in the world today. They understand something's gone wrong with their religion, and they want their religion to be reformed. They are in fear of their life even for saying that. We should be doing everything we can to protect and defend and encourage these people. But if our politicians are saying this thing has got nothing to do with religion, if our politicians are saying this thing has got nothing to do with Islam, it cuts these reformers off at the knees. Because what are they doing? They're trying to reform their religion. Why? This thing's got nothing to do with religion, or so we're told. So it abandons the bravest Muslims in the world on whom we should be relying to bring about what seems to be so impossible, a reformation of their religion. Now, all this has been going on for years. These cultural trends that I've been talking about, this Islamophobia phobia, and the people have now revolted. The people of Britain, of mainland Europe, and of America, they want their culture and their countries back. They want to live in a self-governing nation, a nation whose culture they can identify with which they share. They want to see their nation fight for its defense against whether it's radical Islam or whether it's Vladimir Putin. They want their nation to fight for the West, for freedom, and for all the values that the West embodies. Now, the Brexit vote, in my view, was the embodiment of that revolt. It wasn't that people sat around saying, you know, this culture war's got to stop, I'm going to vote Brexit. They didn't say that. They didn't say that. But at the heart of what they were revolting against was a whole worldview which had denigrated Western or British national identity for all the reasons that I'm describing. And so the revolt against the membership of the European Union was actually a revolt against this worldview. And that is why the left in Britain will not give up. For them, it is not simply a question of having lost an argument. This argument cannot be lost. It cannot be lost. It's as if the world's turning backwards on its axis. It has to be changed. They have to reverse Brexit. Why? Not simply because they want to be part of Europe, because it's a whole world view that is now threatened, resting on the restoration of Western national identity and what you and I once called, and no doubt you still call, patriotism. Brexit was the first time in 4 or 5 decades of culture wars that I have seen a victory for my side of the argument and for the defense of the West. The first time ever. That's how epical that was. Because far from being the source of bad things, the Western nation is essential for the defense of Western values. The nation brings people together in support of a common project called the nation. The nation supersedes divisions based on tribes, divisions based on groups fighting for supremacy. It unites people behind a shared history, a language, religion, traditions, expressed through a government passing its own laws. Undermining the nation has undermined democracy and has made it impossible for the West to defend itself, because you cannot defend something you no longer believe in or even understand. And that's what Brexit was about. It was not anti-immigrant. It's said to be anti-immigrant because by hook or by crook, the people who voted Brexit have got to be demonized and delegitimized, and so they're all being called anti-immigrant. It was not anti-immigrant, although fueling Brexit was a tremendous concern about Islamic extremism and the failure of successive governments to get a grip on that problem. But the main reason for Brexit was democracy. People wanted to regain control over their immigration policy. Britain cannot control its immigration policy. It can't decide how many people it wants in the country, what kind of people, while it subscribes, while it's part of the European Union with its core doctrine of free movement of peoples. People in Britain wanted to regain control over their own laws. At present, laws passed by Britain's sovereign government through the Houses of Parliament, those laws can be overturned by the European Court of Justice. You don't have an independent country if you cannot control your own laws, if you don't have sovereign control over your own laws. So, now, something similar has happened here in America. It's a different situation, obviously. You don't have this transnational madness. You are in control of your own laws. You don't have a foreign court overturning them, and so on. But something similar, it seems to me, happened here. And it's more difficult to see because whether or not you all are Trump supporters, I don't know. But President Trump is clearly a divisive figure, and consequently, it's difficult to see to understand or acknowledge properly the forces that brought him to power. But I think there is a great need to separate out the leader or the man from what he represents and what brought him to power in such an extraordinary way. Because it seemed to me, listening to what he was saying, this great phrase, "Make America Great Again," in Britain, that is proof positive. He is a white supremacist. Making America Great Again was Charles Lindbergh, it was fascism, it was Nazism. America is lost. America is now as a country which, how many millions voted for President Trump? All those millions are basically Charles Lindbergh, white supremacists, Nazis and fascists. That's what you are. So this to me is ridiculous. When I heard "Make America Great Again," I thought, thank God someone is saying this. Because to me, what that meant was that America would once again find again the confidence and the courage to say, we believe that the country of America, that the nation of America that we are in, is the greatest in the world because it stands for the greatest values that we can aspire to. Liberty, democracy, real human rights, and we are prepared to make it the greatest country again so that we can fully realize those values again, and that we can be a beacon unto other nations, and that we can help make the world a better place simply by being us. That to me was what making America great again meant, and it also meant to me, is what I was listening to him saying, and I think one or two of the things he has done since he became president, despite all the difficulties and all the caveats, he has shown that he understands that if America interests are threatened, America will fight to defend itself. It will no longer say, oh no, we can't fight to defend ourselves, we can only fight to defend people that we've historically oppressed in the past. No, it's going to say, if you hit us in America, we will hit you so hard you won't do it again. And to me, this is the first sign of a possible return to health of the West itself. Now, President Trump, it seems to me, is himself work in progress. This Nevertheless, he's already shown that his instincts, and instincts, it seems to me, for President Trump are really quite important. His instincts are to defend America's interests. He will not allow those who attack America to do so with impunity, and he reverses not just the last few years when America retreated from that role, but this will reverse the whole dominant Western progressive ideology, which says war to defend Western interests is never justified because the West is not justifiable, that those who attack the West do so because of what the West has done to them, and so they can never be held to account. Instead, if the developing world hits us, we must never go to war to defend our own interests, we must negotiate, we must do conflict resolution, we must do peace processes, we must do international law, we must never ever do war because war never solves anything. How many times have I heard war never solves anything? Astonishing. What would these people have said in 1939? Well, I think we know what they did say in 1939. War never solves anything. So we have a situation now where what I will call national identity patriots defending the West are called racists, white supremacists, and fascists. This is a lie, it's a libel. However, it's messy, because some of the people who are riding this national identity tide are indeed dubious people, and they are dubious particularly in Europe. No time to go into all of them, but look at what's happening in France. Madame Le Pen no longer calls herself the Front National. She no longer apparently has a party. She no longer even has a surname. She is no longer Marine Le Pen. She is Marine Présidente. Why? Because she has to detoxify and de-demonize what she represents by pretending that she is not. But I don't believe her. I believe that she does still represent a threat to freedom and democracy. And I can't prove it, but I feel it. I think that she betrays herself by the people that she surrounds herself by some remarks that she makes, despite her carefulness to sanitize herself. So, I think that she actually is a dangerous individual, and there are others in mainland Europe who are also dangerous individuals, but nevertheless there are also others who are simply what I would call national identity conservatives or even liberals. I know that you had here Geert Wilders from the Netherlands. Geert Wilders did not make it in the national scene as was expected. He didn't make it to become leader of his of his country, but nevertheless, Geert Wilders is not a fascist, he's a liberal. He's very liberal. He's much more liberal than most of you. And yet he's called a fascist because he dares to defend the West and he dares to name what the West is up against in terms of Islamic fascism. So some people are simply national identity conservatives. Others are, in Europe, mainland Europe, truly dangerous. Nevertheless, I am optimistic for this reason. I think the underlying trend, the return of the Western nation, has the option, offers the possibility now, which wasn't so before, of saving the West. And the hope lies, for me, the hope lies in the resurgence of what I will call the Anglosphere, Britain and America, not mainland Europe. In Europe, I fear it's all gone too far. I fear Islamization has gone too far, and more to the point, the countries of mainland Europe do not actually have the kind of visceral understanding of what a nation is, what an independent nation is, and what liberty is in the way that the Anglosphere does. Britain understands it, America understands it. And I don't wish to insult people like Australia and New Zealand and Canada. I'm sure they understand it as well. But it's the Anglosphere in which I think we can rest some degree of optimism. And I think that the return of national identity, if Britain leaves the European Union, if the European Union falls apart, people are terrified by this, they say, if the European Union falls apart, then we'll get fascism, because we'll get the return of the nation, and Germany will be unleashed, and all these countries will have a resurgent nationalism, and it'll be chaos, and it'll be fascism and Nazism, and there'll be another Holocaust. To which I say, look at what's happening in mainland Europe now. You have the rise of extreme ultra-nationalist and neo-Nazi parties as a direct result of the European Union suppressing the nation. Because the desire for national identity has to emerge. And unfortunately, if the entire political establishment refuses to go down that national identity road, which is what has happened, then you create the vacuum into which obnoxious parties can come, and people in their desperation will vote for obnoxious parties. You have a situation now in France. I think it's a desperate situation in France. You have Marine Le Pen, who I think has not, to my satisfaction, got rid of the taint of anti-democracy, fascism, anti-Semitism that she inherited from her father. You have her on the one camp. On the other camp, you have Emmanuel Macron, who famously came from nowhere and was beamed in from another planet and is said to be a centrist. So that's all right. Phew, we think he's going to win. My goodness, West saved. He's a centrist. Really? What does a centrist mean? What does he stand for? He thinks that the solution to the problems of the absence of democracy in France and the Islamization of France is more and deeper European Union. He thinks you have to increase the loss of power of France to save it. And this man is called a centrist. He is against Marine Le Pen. Now, if you're a Democrat, if you're a person who's worried about the erosion of freedom in France, if you're a Jewish person in France and you have been betrayed by successive governments who do nothing to stop you being, recently a Jewish woman, a 66-year-old Jewish woman, was thrown out of her window in her own house. Thrown out of her window. And apparently that wasn't an anti-Semitic crime. It wasn't an anti-Jewish crime because the man was said to be deranged, even though he shouted Allahu Akbar as he did it, and even though his family had subjected the victim's family to months of anti-Jewish abuse, but it wasn't an anti-Semitic crime. So if you're a Jewish person in France, who do you vote for in this election? Who do you vote for? This is a desperate situation. I don't know how it's going to end, and I shudder for Europe as a result. So this is not going to happen in a straightforward way. We're going to see a fight to the death of the progressive worldview. We have a titanic battle underway in Western culture. You're seeing a titanic battle underway now against your elected president. And how these battles are resolved will determine whether the West continues on its suicidal path or whether it can now pull itself back from the brink. And the leaders who have surfaced in these tumultuous times themselves reflect the confusion of the times. In my view, the leaders who have surfaced have emerged less because of their innate qualities of statesmanship and more because of the inadequacy of the alternatives. In the United Kingdom, Theresa May was an accidental prime minister. She's popular. She's popular. She became prime minister by accident because her predecessor made a catastrophic mistake. He thought he could basically bully Britain into staying in the European Union. What a mistake that was. He fell on his sword. She became prime minister because everybody else basically knifed each other in the front and the back simultaneously. And nobody was more surprised than Mrs. Theresa May when she became prime minister. And she is very popular. She's popular because she's very British, she's very restrained, she's very quiet, she's very serious, she doesn't treat politics as a game. These are all good things. These are all good things. However, this is a prime minister who says, I never read any history. How can you have the leader of a country who never reads any history? I'll bet Donald Trump reads history every night, don't you think? Anyway. So you have the accidental prime minister in Britain. Here you have a president who is on, let us put it this way, a steep learning curve and may fall off it altogether. The West, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the West is at a historic tipping point. Whether our leader, it's at a historic tipping point, and I am hopeful in that until Brexit, there was no tipping point. There was nothing. We were just going down. Now there's a tipping point. Now there's a question. Now there's a possibility. I don't know how it's going to resolve itself. It may go pear-shaped, or we may actually find this was the point at which the West saved itself. I don't know. But it is a tipping point. And whether our leaders are up to this momentous civilizational burden, which now rests on their shoulders, is a very open question indeed. Thank you very much.
We thought we'll just jump right in with a serious topic, and then we'll maybe get lighter later on. One of the questions is, why do we not hear a peep from British feminists about the spreading horror of female genital mutilation? that's take. Do you have a comment on that?
We're taking one at a time. Are we taking one at a time?
Yes.
Yeah. Why do feminists not protest at female genital mutilation? Broadly, because it's almost comical. If it would be comical were it not so distressing and dangerous and indeed tragic. But when you have political correctness, if you have two political correct doctrines in conflict with each other, you get a kind of paralysis. Feminism is one such ideology, one such doctrine. But another doctrine is that no developing world person can ever be criticized for anything. And consequently, untold thousands of girls and women who are being mutilated by female genital mutilation, their plight is being completely ignored by people who call themselves feminists. And it just shows the moral bankruptcy of an ideology when it takes hold in this way. It suspends moral judgment, it suspends rationality, it suspends decency. It's not just over female genital mutilation, but the whole oppressive nature of so many developing world societies, Muslim societies, the oppression of women generally, the fact that they have half the value of a man, the fact that Muslim societies oppress homosexuals, the fact that they do not permit people to leave Islam without murdering them. None of this has any kind of purchase on the progressive conscience whatsoever, because of the iron doctrine that you never criticize a member of, or you never criticize the developing world, because the developing world is the victim of the West, and only the West can ever be morally to blame.
Thank you. Everyone, or a lot of people in this audience, including yourself, were enthusiastic about Brexit. Should Scotland succeed from the EU, from the UK, excuse me?
Should Scotland secede from the United Kingdom because we're also enthusiastic about Brexit? There are many people in England who would very much fervently hope that Scotland would float away into the North Sea and never be seen again. However, the point about Scotland is that it voted, its people voted overwhelmingly for Remain. They voted against Brexit. But of course, the United Kingdom voted as one country. So that doesn't really count, except that the Scottish nationalists make a great deal of this, that Scotland voted for Remain, and therefore Scotland should be entitled to be independent from Britain, because Scotland wishes to remain inside the European Union. Now, the first thing to say is that this is Groundhog Day all over again. The Scots had a referendum on leaving Britain only, whatever it was, a couple of years ago. They voted against it because they've got more sense. And here they are being expected to go through the whole thing again. My own view is that I am sympathetic to the Scots up to a point, because the Scots, you may not quite appreciate this, but the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is a kind of archipelago of nations. England, Scotland, Wales, and, well, Northern Ireland, let's not go into private grief over Ireland, but anyway. And Scotland does have an independent history as a sovereign nation. It had its own king, it has its own laws still. It has a separate legal system. It has a separate church. It still has the appurtenances of a nation. So I kind of understand and sympathize with where they're coming from, because I do sympathize with people who have a genuine claim to national identity. However, there is another identity at stake. There is another nation at stake, which is the nation of the United Kingdom. And I don't think that Scotland has the right to declare independence, because it does not have the right to break up the United Kingdom. If the United Kingdom is to be broken up by Scotland leaving it, then the United Kingdom should vote on that as a matter of principle. That's the first thing to say. The second thing is that although there's a great deal of shouting and screaming going on by the Scottish nationalist leader Nicola Sturgeon on the basis that the Scottish people voted for Remain and therefore they should now have a second referendum on independence and they should be allowed to become members of the European Union, there are various problems with this. First of all, the European doesn't want Scotland. I mean, it really doesn't. It says, you think you're just going to join the European Union because you want, you've got another thing coming. You have to go at the back of the queue because we've got other secessionist people in Europe lining up to be to secede from their countries, and you think we're going to give them this example? You think again. That's the first thing. The second thing is they'd have to join the euro, and they want to keep the pound. So they're not very, it makes no sense. So the whole thing is a nonsense. The whole thing is simply a political stunt. It's designed just to make trouble. In my view, there is no way that the Scottish people, who are actually very sensible and canny, and they got their heads screwed on the right way, there is no way that they would, in their own interest, ever vote to leave the United Kingdom and join the dying behemoth of Europe. Why on earth would anyone wish to yoke themselves to this flailing monster that is basically dying before our very eyes? Makes no sense whatsoever.
Thank you. And we won't spend the whole time on Brexit, but I thought this was a very interesting question. Is there any way Britain can flub it up, the implementation of leaving the EU?
Flub? Is that being divided by a common language again?
Yes, we are. Yes, foul it up.
Foul it up. Okay. Flub. Okay.
I didn't know that was an Americanism. Now we know that.
You give me flub, I'll give you pear-shaped. Is there any way that Mrs. May could completely make a complete Horlicks, as we say in England, of Brexit? Yes, I'm afraid there is. It all depends on... This is a game of poker. And it all depends on who actually understands where the advantage lies. Now, Mrs. May was herself a Remainer. She voted Remain. But she voted Remain very, very quietly in the hope that nobody would remember in case it all went the other way. And then look what happened. She became Prime Minister of a Brexit country. So now she's for Brexit. So I don't actually have a great deal of confidence that she really gets it. However, what she does get is the politics. What she does get is that Britain voted to come out, and there will be political hell to pay if she fouls it up. It all depends on whether she understands that all the cards are in her own hands. Because Europe, the EU people are shouting and screaming, and they're threatening bloody mayhem. They are threatening this and that. They're going to cut you off from this, and you've got to pay us, blood money. I mean, it's like the mafia. You've got to pay us, 60 million, billion, squillion pounds before we'll even sit down and have a cup of tea with you. It's ridiculous. The balance of trade is in Britain's favour. They need Britain more than Britain needs them. Britain does need them, it's true. But they need Britain much more than Britain needs them. Britain is a very large economy. It's the 5th largest economy in the world. Unlike Europe, mainland Europe, it is not intrinsically a basket case. It has a sense of itself as a nation. Its intelligence gathering service, its intelligence service at this a very difficult time for the West is second only, in my view, to the Israelis. Europe needs Britain. Who do they think they're kidding? And so, in my view, and I'm not sort of somebody who is known to advocate appeasement and compromise. It's true. That's I'm sort of gung ho, but nevertheless, I would have thought that the correct approach was to say, we're not even going to have a negotiation. We're leaving. You want something from us? We're very happy to come and talk to you. But we're leaving. We're going. And, you want to put punitive tariffs on us? Be our guest and see who comes off worst. Now, will Mrs. May do that? Mrs. May, who is very, very cautious and doesn't do anything without consulting her closest advisors, who keeps her cards so close to her chest, who is very nervous, who didn't even have the courage to say that she was a Remainer. I don't see it myself, but who knows? Maybe she will step up to the plate. So the short answer to the question is, I fear that she may muck it up. I trust that the British people will, keep her to her promise, and that she will deliver what she should be delivering. But I'm not sure.
Thank you. This next question could go on forever, but hopefully there's a concise way to answer it. It's an issue which is a problem in the U.S., and we know it is in the U.K. because of the news. And that's the kids of Muslims who, grown up in Western culture and like Western culture, they become radicalized. So it's like the first generation gets it. They've come and want to integrate, but then their offspring don't.
This is something that many people have puzzled over, and I don't pretend to have the answer at all. The first thing to say, which is pretty obvious, is that the generation that came, that were the primary immigrants into Britain, mainly from Pakistan and Bangladesh, who came in the late, I think most of them came in the 80s. They were just people who came for a job and for a better life. And they weren't particularly religious, and they were very poor, and they came for better opportunities. And they settled particularly in the north of England, where the cotton mills were in difficulties, and as it happened, they all died, and it didn't all work out. But anyway, what nobody appreciated at the time was that these countries, Bangladesh and Pakistan, many of their religious institutions had been radicalized by the Saudi version of Islam, which is the version that we're principally suffering from, which is the extreme version. And therefore, when they came to Britain, they brought with them their educational institutions, which themselves were radicalized. And so they themselves were fine, but their children went to these educational institutions and became radicalized. That was one way in which the children became much more radical than the parents. Now, that's not the only explanation. There are other explanations. And one of the most persuasive explanations that seems to me to hold true, and I don't want to give you the impression this is the explanation, because this is a complex subject and there are many other factors for sure. But the thing that really struck me was this idea that I'm sure is true, that for many of these young Muslim kids, they really are stranded in a kind of cultural no man's land. They are born in Britain. They are British kids. They go to mainly mainstream British schools. They are exposed, therefore, to the full force of their peer group. Their peer group, particularly in benighted areas of Britain, morality has simply fallen apart. And they are bombarded, these Muslim kids, with, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Sex and drugs in particular. And they come from families which are not pious, but nevertheless, they have a very strict code of family ethics. And this is simply not acceptable at home. And so they come from this kind of village mentality, village morality, if you like, village culture. And they go to school and they grow up in a completely different, morally degraded culture, which sucks them in. They participate in it fully. And then they will be vulnerable to preachers who come along and they hook them on the basis that they are basically doing some violence to their own psyche, whether they end up in prison or university. They're not quite the same thing. They are young people who are adrift. They are in a world, but they think they shouldn't be in the world. And anyway, they're confused. They are isolated. They are not anchored. And along comes the radical preacher. And some of these radical preachers are very, very shrewd indeed. And at university, they pitch it so cleverly. They use people who are of the highest intelligence to approach these young people. And they basically say to them, what are you doing with your life? Look at you, look at you. You're a Muslim boy. This degradation, you're doing dishonor to yourself and to your people. You have no purpose to your life. You have no nobility to your life. This is how you get nobility. You defend your people against what's being done to them, because we are the victims of the West, of the Jews, of the Americans, whatever it is. And they've hooked them. They've hooked them. And for me, that is, I mean, I see this being played out over and over again. It has, to me, an emotional and psychological resonance. I'm sure that is a very considerable part of the problem, but it's not the whole problem.
Yeah, very complicated. This might be a little lighter. What happened with Tony Blair? Is he an elder statesman? Does he make statements? Or is he did he go hide?
Please, Tony Blair is a war criminal. Please get it right.
Oh, pardon me.
I'm not quite sure whether the question is what happened to Tony Blair himself, or what happens to how people thought of Tony Blair. Perhaps I'll speak to both of those things because they are connected. Tony Blair was a kind of political hologram. He arrived on the scene in the Labour Party in the mid-80s. He was a lawyer. He became a Labour Member of Parliament. And he was a young, radical politician who correctly understood, just like his great friend Bill Clinton, he correctly understood that the left had a major problem because everyone was buying into the market, the free market. And so the left was like, I mean, what, trade unions? Trade unions had become oppressive. They had become people who were a kind of conspiracy against the public. So, you know, and the Labour Party had grown out of the trade union movement. So he had to kind of reform the whole Labour Party. And he decided to do this by adopting a combination of the free market and the kind of cultural revolution that I've been talking about. He decided to transform Britain by mass immigration, by sweeping away the whole panoply of a sort of moral constraints in favor of freedom. I happen to know, because I spoke to him at the time, that he was very concerned about the erosion of the family, the traditional family. But he stopped being concerned because the forces that he was unleashing sort of swept him along. And so he became identified with this kind of hollowed out progressivism. And then the Iraq War happened. He was very, very popular because he emoted. His lip trembled with everybody. And what made him was the death of Princess Diana. You may recall Princess Diana, iconic figure for many Britons because they all felt that she felt their pain. And she was killed in a traffic accident. And Blair came up with this amazing soundbite. She was the people's princess. And more than that, he effectively saved the monarchy because the people were turning against the Queen as not being sufficiently emoting enough. And it was a very ugly mood. And to his great credit, Blair saw this. He told the Queen, you know, Mom, you got to get down here and you got to save this. And she did. She listened to him. So all that was to his credit. But basically, he was presiding over, in my view, a set of principles that weren't principles at all. And consequently, the Iraq War happened. And that unleashed something in the Western psyche, which has nothing to do with Blair. It was to do with the belief that America had it coming to it in 9/11. That's what it was about. America had it. I heard it said, your ambassador to the United Kingdom was reduced to tears on television the week after 9/11 by people saying you had it coming to you. And what do they mean by that? They meant that America supported Israel. And it was Israel's oppression of the Palestinians that had caused 9/11. That's what Britain thought. It was a madness that took over. And then the whole business of the Iraq War was only happening because of a conspiracy of Jews extending from Jerusalem to Washington, D.C. This was being said openly in respectable public prints. And then, unfortunately, with the fall of Saddam Hussein, it wasn't handled well, and we then saw what happened. And Britain decided at that point that never again would it go to war in the Middle East about anything, that it would never again believe its intelligence service about anything, it would never believe the American intelligence service about anything, and that Tony Blair had led Britain to war on a lie. The lie was that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. The lie was that Saddam was a threat to the West. It was a lie. And that belief took hold to such an extent that just, I don't know, a couple of years ago, I went to a public meeting in the Westminster area, which was addressed by Tony Blair. Tony Blair is actually a religious man. He converted, in fact, to Catholicism. And he was taking part in a discussion in a very large place in Westminster on religion. I think he was in discussion with the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I went along because I was interested in his take on religion. And as I turned the corner, I heard screaming and shouting. And this was like a couple of years ago, many years after the Iraq War. And I turned the corner, and there was a mass demonstration screaming, Blair, war criminal. And they had posters which were printed, B-L-I-A-R. B-L-I-A-R.
Blair.
Blair. This is a madness. So this was part of the madness of Britain. But he didn't help himself, because he then went on, when he stopped being Prime Minister, he went on to make a very, very great deal of money. And he was then accused of greed, of feathering his nest, of doing anything for money, having sold his soul for money. He didn't help himself as a result. Now he's come along and said, hey, Britain, this Brexit thing, it's completely wrong, and I'm the man who is going to reverse it.
Wow.
And I can tell you, that's gone down like a bucket of sick.
I was going to say.
So that's
those are really
nutshell.
bad political instincts. Wow.
Well, he is a fanatic. He is a fanatic for Europe. He is a fanatic for the kind of transnationalism. All the things I was talking to you about earlier, the idea that transnationalism will not only bring about peace on earth, but will eradicate prejudice from the human heart. He really believes it. He really believes it. And so to him, Brexit cannot stand. It cannot stand, because Britain will go to hell on a handcart if it becomes an independent, self-governing nation again. That's what he believes. And so he's put himself at the head of this movement. Wow. And everyone's going, you're kidding me? So that's Mr. Blair.
So now we know where he is. Going back to a little bit to serious, it seems that the questioner wants to know, seems like there's no future for the Jews in Europe. Is that correct? So you'll speak to that first. And then if so, is it only a matter of time before similar events happen in the U.S.?
Well, is it all over for the Jews of Europe? I'm asked this the whole time, and indeed the Jews of Europe asking it the whole time of themselves. No one can answer this question. The Jews of Europe can't be talked about in a generality, because they are in a different situation in different countries of Europe. So the Jews of Britain are in a different place, really, from the Jews of France, Sweden, Belgium and the Netherlands. Those countries are countries where they are under a great deal of very, very violent attack from violent Muslims. That's not the case in Britain. In Britain, so far, we have not had the kind of thing that they've had in France, where, as I said, this Jewish lady got thrown out the window, where every so often a Jew is murdered and picked off, where Jewish schools are physically attacked with great violence. You may remember after the Charlie Hebdo massacre, do you remember the cartoonists that were massacred in France? It was 2015, I think it was. So a very short while after that, as part of the same wave of attacks, a Jewish grocery store was attacked, and Jews were murdered there, and a Jewish school was attacked, but in fact I think nobody was killed on that occasion. And that was the first time that people in Britain woke up to the fact that Jews are being singled out for attack. I mean, this is the point. They are being singled out by Muslims for attack because in the pantheon of Islamic diabolism, the Jews have a particular place. So that's mainland Europe. In Britain, Jews are under attack, but less so. So there's a lot of what's considered to be attacks on Jews are running at record levels. It's true, but most of those are kind of abuse in the street or attacks on cemeteries. I'm not for a moment denying the significance or importance of those, but I'm just saying it's a different order of magnitude to, say, France. So in France, because the violence against Jews is so obviously singling them out for extreme violence, a lot of French Jews have come to live in Israel. Although a lot still remain, whereas in Britain, the level of pain, if I can put it like that, of the Jewish community is nowhere near the level which would actually prompt them to say, I think it's time to move. What many British Jews are saying is, I fear for the future for my children and grandchildren here, because they're looking to the future, they see a steady Islamization of the country, and they see the progressive side of politics, by which I don't just mean the political left, but I mean also people who may vote conservative, but who are basically, the educated classes. They're abandoning the Jews to their fate, basically. They just don't want to know. And they're very, very hostile to Israel. The better educated you are in Britain, the more hostile you are to Israel. It's another phenomenon. So
same here.
Right.
US.
So Jews feel very isolated and very, very concerned. On the other hand, there's a very significant number of Jews that don't feel anything like this at all in Britain. It's perfectly possible in Britain, if you're a British Jew. If you're the kind of British Jew who actually doesn't even care or think about Israel, or who actually shares, because of your political position, you share many of the false impressions that are so damaging about Israel, then you kind of tune out a lot of stuff that's going on, and you just don't notice it. And then again, there are many secular people who are of Jewish origin who are actually leading this terrible delegitimization of Israel. So it's a very complicated situation. But generally, I would say the Jews of Europe do not have a long-term future. And I myself spend a great deal of time in Israel. I have family in both. My main work is in Britain. My husband is in Britain. But I spend time in both. And I feel more comfortable now in Israel than I do in Britain. Even though it's one of the most dangerous places in the world to be, there are people literally just down the road who, given half a chance, would come at me with a knife. I feel safer there. It's sort of psychically safer. Will it happen here? It's a different situation here. It's a different demographic, but the main threat to the Jews here at the moment and for the foreseeable future is that they themselves are assimilating and losing their Jewish separate identity. This trend is very, very pronounced in the American Jewish community, even more than it is in the rest of Europe.
Well, you've just reiterated how you spend your time between Britain and Israel, and we'd love to have you here more often. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Melanie Phillips.